I'm Claire Monroe, 31 years old, and I never thought I'd be standing in that courthouse, let alone with my name printed on a badge that didn't even belong to me. It said, K. Nobody bold and deliberate like someone had chosen it on purpose. My sister stood across the atrium in her ivory blazer, calm and poised, like this was all routine. My mother wouldn't look me in the eye. And me, I just kept walking forward, holding a leather portfolio I'd carried through every important moment of my life, even if this one wasn't supposed to be about me. Before I go any further, drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from, and if you've ever walked into a room knowing you weren't really welcome. Growing up in Beaufort, South Carolina, I was the quiet one in a family that didn't have much time for quiet. My parents, especially my mother, held high standards for presentation and public image, and my older sister Rachel always seemed to meet them with ease. She was the one who won the school awards, ran student council, made friends with anyone in 5 seconds flat. I was the one who stayed in the background, kind, dependable, forgettable. At least that's how it felt most days. I never tried to compete. I didn't see the point. Our family made it clear early on which daughter they were proud of and which one they merely tolerated. And still I stuck to what I believed in. I worked hard, earned scholarships, built a life rooted in values like honesty, compassion, and humility, even when none of it earned a second glance at home. That day at the courthouse, I told myself I was just there to observe, maybe lend quiet support to what Rachel described as a distant cousin's custody hearing. She'd asked me to show up, said it might help the family image if someone like me was seen in the gallery. I should have known better. When I reached the check-in table and gave my name, the woman scanned her list and handed me a badge without a second thought. I clipped it on, barely looking, until I felt something sharp brush against my skin. When I glanced down, it didn't say Claire Monroe. It said K. Nobody. I tried to correct it, but the woman behind the table just shrugged and told me that's what the list had. I stood there for a second badge pinned to my blazer, and from across the hall, Rachel was already lifting her phone, clicking a photo like she'd won a bet. She smiled just enough to make sure I saw it. I didn't give her the reaction she was looking for. I straightened my spine, nodded once, and walked away. But as I passed through the hallway and found my seat in the back, the badge still clung to me like a bruise. My mother sat 3 rows ahead. She didn't turn around. The courtroom lights were dimmer than I expected. My heels made small sounds on the marble, each one louder than I felt inside. Rachel passed by me with that same perfume she always wore, leaned in just enough and said, "No one invited you, Claire. Just remember that." Then she moved on like nothing had been said. I stayed seated, holding onto the edges of the bench, pretending I didn't feel the sting, because deep down I knew this wasn't just a hearing. It was something else entirely. And whatever Rachel had planned, this was only the beginning. The courtroom was still filling in when the bailiff closed the doors. The soft rustle of jackets, whispered instructions between attorneys, the faint echo of heels moving across the floor, it all blended into a quiet kind of tension. I kept my eyes forward, hands folded neatly on my lap, the badge on my chest pressing into my skin like a splinter. K. Nobody. I tried not to think about it, but every now and then my gaze would drift down and catch it again, black letters printed like fact. Rachel sat just ahead, angled slightly so the light caught her perfectly. Her attorney stood smoothing his tie and straightening his notes with that kind of rehearsed calm that always comes right before something cruel. "Your Honor," he began, "we'd like to start with a brief visual presentation just to provide context regarding certain disruptions tied to today's proceedings." The word context made my stomach turn. A screen lit up on the far wall, and the courtroom lights dimmed just enough to cast long shadows across the gallery benches. I felt my shoulders tense. Then I saw it, my own face, huge, projected on the wall. I was caught mid-step, looking down the badge clearly visible. There it was in bold K. Nobody. The image was still, but the room reacted like it was moving. Soft gasps. Someone clearing their throat. A juror whispered to the person next to them. Rachel didn't even blink. Her attorney clicked to the next slide. This photo was taken this morning, 7:16 a.m., well before court officially opened. The presence of individuals not listed on the schedule, particularly those with potential emotional instability, raises concerns regarding courtroom security and procedural order. I sat motionless, but inside something shifted. I'd parked at 7:52. I'd taken a picture of the courthouse myself, time-stamped. I remembered because I'd checked the map, double-checked my bag, then snapped the photo before walking in. Whatever was on that screen, whatever they were claiming was false. Someone had changed the timestamp. They hadn't just humiliated me, they'd planted a story. The judge leaned slightly forward. "Is Miss Monroe on the witness list?" he asked. Rachel's attorney offered a small smile. "No, Your Honor. She arrived on her own, unscheduled, uninvited, as you can see from the badge." He let the sentence hang in the air like it pained him to say it. But I saw the pride in it, the precision, the performance. I looked across the aisle. Rachel was watching the screen like a proud curator at a gallery showing. She didn't glance my way. She didn't have to. I recognized the tactic. 16 years ago, our parents hosted a birthday party for both of us, something they did every year. That year, Rachel had left my name off the invitations. Every classmate who showed up thought it was just for her, and she never corrected them. I spent most of the night alone on the backyard swing set, holding a slice of cake and pretending I wasn't waiting for someone to notice. This moment felt like that again, only louder. The judge tapped his pen on the desk. "Miss Monroe, do you have a response?" I stood. My knees were steady, but I could feel the heat rising behind my ears. "The timestamp on that image is incorrect," I said clearly. "I have a photograph of my own showing the correct time. I parked at 7:52, not 7:16. There was a murmur but no immediate reaction from the bench. No questions. No validation. Just the rustle of paperwork continuing like my voice hadn't mattered at all. Then something changed. A court clerk stepped forward holding a sealed envelope. No markings, no return label, just plain heavy paper. The judge took it, opened it carefully, and scanned the contents in silence. He glanced at me just briefly and then turned to the court reporter. "Please enter this into the hearing exhibits. Mark as Addendum A." Then he looked back at me. "Miss Monroe," he said, voice neutral, "are you aware that there's a psychological evaluation bearing your name from the Charleston Mental Health Institute, dated November 2012? The air around me thinned. That year, that place, I hadn't spoken of it in over a decade. I barely let myself think about it. It wasn't treatment. It wasn't therapy. It was silence paperwork wrapped around something my family never wanted to confront." Rachel's attorney stood again. "We bring this forward with care, Your Honor. A concerned party uncovered this document, and we believe it speaks to stability, specifically emotional regulation and behavioral risk." The screen shifted again. Now it showed a scanned page. Clinical, cold. My name. A list of terms I didn't recognize: instability, dysregulation, disorder. It didn't match anything I remembered because none of it came from me. I wasn't unstable. I was 22. I had been locked out of our shared apartment in the middle of a snowstorm, barefoot without a coat, while Rachel laughed with her friends from the window. "She'll be fine," they said. "She always freaks out over nothing." A neighbor called an ambulance. I shook through the night wrapped in a foil blanket in the back of an EMT van. The next morning, my mother drove me to a hospital outside the city. Quiet. Controlled. She signed the papers herself. I stayed for 72 hours. When I came back, no one mentioned it again, until now. The judge asked if I had anything to say. I stood slow and steady. That file was created without my consent. I wasn't evaluated or diagnosed. I was placed there by family members who didn't want the truth getting out. The real danger wasn't me. The real danger was being locked out in a snowstorm because I came home on a weekend I wasn't expected. There was no verdict, no reply, just a nod to enter the statement into the record. As I sat down, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A man rose from the back row and approached the bailiff. They spoke briefly. Then the bailiff looked toward the bench and nodded. The judge adjusted the microphone. "Miss Monroe," he said, "please remain seated. There's been a development." Rachel's head whipped around. Her posture changed for the first time that morning. The gavel tapped twice, not to close the session, but to pause it. "We'll take a brief recess," the judge said, legal counsel and named parties to follow me to chambers. The man who had stood the one in the back row was already moving. He walked with a calm, deliberate pace, a sealed envelope in hand. He passed Rachel without even glancing in her direction, but she shifted when he did. Just slightly, like something in her recognized the shift. I followed the others down the hallway toward the judge's chambers. The wood along the walls felt older there, quiet, like nothing flashy needed to happen for the truth to matter. The door closed behind us, and for the first time all day, Rachel looked uncertain. What happened next would change the entire course of the hearing. But I hadn't seen the full picture yet, only the corners of what had been hiding just beneath the surface. The judge's chambers were colder than the rest of the courthouse, not in temperature exactly, more in atmosphere. The wood along the walls was darker, older, and the silence that settled in after the door closed was the kind that made people straighten their backs without realizing it. The man from the gallery, Vincent, stood calmly at the edge of the table, placing a sealed envelope on the desk in front of the judge. His coat was still perfectly pressed. "You'll want to review this before continuing," he said. "It pertains to the unauthorized use of sealed federal records, specifically Exhibit 14B. His voice was clear, his tone steady. Rachel didn't say anything at first. Then, without turning toward him, she finally spoke. "That's absurd." Her voice had lost the sweetness it usually carried in public. "You can't just barge in here with half a story and think it'll stick." Vincent didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "We're not guessing, Miss Monroe. We've been tracking flagged system queries for the past 2 months, all tied to this case, all traced back to your credentials or ones accessed through your staff." The judge opened the envelope and flipped through the documents. I saw my name listed along with access logs, timestamps, login locations. It was all printed in black and white. There was nothing vague about it. Rachel's attorney shifted in his seat, leaning forward, but the judge held up a hand. "If what you're saying is true, then sealed mental health records were used in open court to discredit a non-party." He looked toward Rachel. "And you would know better than anyone what that means." Rachel's face didn't move, but something in her expression hardened. She turned slowly toward me. "You think I'm scared of you?" she said, quiet but sharp. "I built this courtroom. You're just a footnote I let hang around too long." I didn't respond. I didn't have to. Vincent had already said it all. "I'm not here to defend her," he said, nodding toward me. "I'm here to expose you." After that, the room emptied in silence. No one raised their voice. No one made eye contact. Rachel moved down the hallway like nothing had changed. But I noticed how her stride was quicker now, how her mouth had drawn into a line that wasn't quite as firm as it had been an hour ago. When I stepped back into the main corridor, the temperature felt different, a little too warm. I wasn't sure where I was going until I found myself outside. The bench beneath the tree didn't offer much shade, but it was far enough from the doors that I could sit without feeling watched. The wind picked up just slightly, and I closed my eyes. The memories came fast. I was 22 again, sitting on the front steps of our apartment building in socks, a coat thrown over my pajamas, my phone dead in my hand. Rachel had changed the locks because she thought it would be funny. She hadn't realized I was coming home early from the trip. She said she'd forgotten, but she also didn't answer her phone, didn't come to the door, even after I knocked for 20 minutes. Her friends had laughed from the window above. One of them pointed and took a photo. I had spent that night at a neighbor's place. The next morning, Mom drove me 2 hours to a hospital in Columbia. She didn't yell, she didn't argue, she just said, "This is how people will see you if you don't get help." I stayed 3 days. No diagnosis, no explanation. Just paperwork, signed under the name of concern. When I came home, nothing was said. It was like it hadn't happened. That silence stretched into everything else. Thanksgivings where Rachel's name was on every speech, Christmases where my gifts were forgotten or handed over still in shopping bags. Graduation where the flowers meant for me ended up in Rachel's arms, and no one asked why. My name was always on the edge of things never quite centered, always spelled right, but said wrong. At some point, you start to wonder if it's easier just to let it happen than to keep asking why. I sat there on the bench until a voice pulled me out of it. "You okay, ma'am?" I looked up. A young woman stood a few feet away holding out a bottle of water. Her courthouse badge read Naira. She couldn't have been more than 22, but her eyes were steady. "I saw what happened in there," she said. "That woman, your sister, she treats people like paper, uses them, throws them out." I took the bottle. "You work for her." "Interned," she said. "Not anymore." There was a pause just long enough to breathe. "You didn't let her win yet," she said. "So don't." I nodded. Not because I was sure, but because her words had landed somewhere that hadn't been touched in a long time. I had said something like that to someone once years ago, a girl in college whose roommate trashed her art project. I remembered the way she smiled when I told her not to let someone else define her worth. That memory rose to the surface now as I stood. My hands were still shaking, but my feet felt grounded again. At the far end of the courtyard, I took out my phone and dialed. Langston picked up after one ring. "Talk to me. I'm ready to file the motion," I said. "Use the full clause. Whistleblower protection. No redactions." There was a pause on the line. Then the familiar grit in his voice returned. "It's about time, Monroe." The call ended. I stayed still for a moment before heading back inside. The building loomed ahead, glass doors bright with sunlight, the sound of distant traffic humming low behind me. Inside, everything had changed. The bailiff stood at the front, quietly directing people out of the gallery. The hearing was being closed legal counsel only. I was no longer just a name on a badge. I was now officially part of the record. Langston gave me a nod as I walked past. I took my seat and waited. There was more to come. More voices, more evidence, more things I hadn't prepared for. But the silence in my chest, the one I'd carried for years, had shifted. And by the time the next witness took the stand, I wasn't afraid of what they might say. I was ready to listen. Then I'd speak. The courtroom had been cleared of reporters, just legal counsel staff and named parties now. The kind of silence that settles in when something important is about to begin had already taken hold. Langston sat just ahead, flipping through a file without looking back. I watched the edge of his collar shift as he breathed steady and unreadable. Across the aisle, Rachel whispered to her attorney. Her voice was low, but she didn't bother hiding the edge in her tone. I didn't need to hear what she said to know it was meant to rattle me. She glanced over once held eye contact for a second longer than necessary, and then turned away like I wasn't worth another moment. The court clerk stepped forward. "Your Honor, she said there's a new witness request from opposing counsel." The judge didn't move right away. Then he gave a slight nod. "Proceed." The courtroom doors opened. A tall man with a trimmed goatee and a leather portfolio under one arm entered his stride, confident but not rushed. The clerk spoke clearly. Dr. Adrian Wolfe, clinical psychiatrist. I froze. I'd heard the name once before years ago during the fallout of my second year at Harvard, but I had never met him. I had certainly never been his patient. He was sworn in and took the stand like he'd done it 100 times. During the Harvard International Fellowship cycle, I was brought in as a consulting specialist to assess the behavioral concerns of one Kaylin Claire Monroe. Concerns included emotional dysregulation, institutional noncompliance, and interpersonal instability. The words were crisp, practiced. Langston stood. Objection, relevance. This witness never treated Ms. Monroe directly. The judge let it continue, noting Langston's concern for the record. I sat still staring forward, watching Rachel's face more than Dr. Wolfe's. Her expression didn't change. Calm, folded hands, eyes forward, as if the outcome had already been decided. Dr. Wolfe continued. While no inpatient treatment was pursued, I recommended academic leave and external review. Her profile, in my professional opinion, aligned with recurring markers of paranoia and boundary distortion. Langston pushed another folder toward me. "You ready?" he asked quietly. I opened it. Inside was a letter signed, dated, and sealed, bearing the letterhead of Professor Laia Marks, the director of the fellowship. I read the lines silently, first, then stood. Your Honor, I'd like to present a statement for the record. This letter is from Professor Marks, confirming I was never under review or treatment by university staff. The document explicitly states that Dr. Wolfe's name does not appear in any internal record tied to my file. I passed the envelope to the clerk. The judge reviewed it briefly, then nodded for me to continue. I took a slow breath. I'd also like to read from my sealed academic grievance file. These statements were submitted during the final semester of my fellowship. He gestured for me to proceed. I opened my portfolio. My hands were cold. I flipped through the pages I'd memorized, but never said aloud. March 17th, 2014. I filed a harassment complaint against 3 fellows in my cohort. The complaint was reviewed, but no action was taken. May 9th, I received treatment for a stress-induced ulcer. My performance had been repeatedly undermined by peer sabotage. I was told to adjust, that I was taking things too seriously. The pages turned one by one. June 4th, emails between Professor Marks and the review committee show concern over ongoing targeting. I was identified in the internal memos as the consistent subject of interference. Despite this, I completed all assigned work and maintained standing in the program. I looked at the last page. I was told more than once that I had a tendency to make things harder than they needed to be. That statement was never part of a medical report. It was a warning, not a diagnosis. When I finished, the room was quiet. Rachel didn't move. Her attorney scribbled something in his notes without looking up. The judge nodded again. Statement will be entered into the record. No applause, no reaction. Just paper being filed in the system that had nearly erased me. Outside the courthouse that afternoon, the wind had shifted. The leaves along Broad Street moved with it, restless but clear. I stood for a while before heading back in. The next session would begin soon. Near the security desk, I overheard 2 clerks talking. "Did you hear who's presiding today?" one asked. "I thought Judge Merrill had this docket. Merrill called out sick. Substitution was filed overnight. They said the name quietly, but I heard it. Monroe. Not me. Langston." I walked through the metal detector, holding my bag close. The glass doors ahead led back into the hearing room. By the time I stepped inside, the bailiff was already speaking. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Langston E. Monroe." He entered from the side robes, pressed face unreadable. Not a flicker of familiarity. He took the bench, placed a folder on the desk, and looked up. Rachel let out a soft, disbelieving laugh. You have got to be kidding me. Her lawyer reached for her sleeve. Not now. This is a joke, right? She said louder. Her fiancé's going to decide the case. Langston spoke clearly. Miss Monroe, my formal recusal from any familial affiliation was filed 3 weeks ago. My role here is procedural, not discretionary. Assignment confirmed through the clerk's office. He opened the file on the bench. Shall we proceed? Rachel didn't respond. Langston turned to the assistant. Enter into Record Exhibit 7C. Full audit disclosure of the Monroe Foundation and its associated trust accounts. The screen behind the bench lit up. Wire transfers, names, account numbers, years. His voice remained calm. $480,000 routed through 3 shell entities: Shellheart Consulting, Red Tree Digital, and Astor Foundation, all tied back to Miss Rachel Monroe's personal accounts, all occurring during inactive trust periods when Claire Monroe's share was legally frozen. No one interrupted, not Rachel, not her attorney. Langston looked over the page, then spoke again. The court finds substantial cause to pursue civil breach inquiry under Fiduciary Code 38.4b. This matter is referred to the Department of Justice for further investigation. The gavel didn't slam. It tapped once, final and clear. Langston stood and exited without another glance. I didn't move at first. When I finally stood, I turned toward the door and caught my reflection in the glass panel. My posture hadn't changed. My name hadn't changed. But something else had. I no longer looked like someone waiting to be included. The room behind me began to empty. Shoes moved across marble. Files closed. People whispered. I reached for the handle, then paused when I heard it. Your Honor, we request an emergency injunction. I turned back toward the bench where Rachel's attorney stood waving a new motion. He wasn't finished. Neither was she. Your Honor, we request an emergency injunction. The words echoed through the chamber, sharp and urgent. I stopped just before reaching the exit. Rachel's attorney was already on his feet, holding a motion in both hands like a flag he wasn't ready to lower. This entire proceeding is compromised, he continued. The presiding judge was romantically involved with the petitioner. We believe that creates a clear conflict of interest. Rachel didn't say anything at first. Then, as the clerk stepped forward to retrieve the document, I caught the corner of her smile. That same tight smile she wore when she got away with something, when she had pulled the string just right and waited for it to unravel. Langston had already stepped down, but he paused, his back straight, his jaw set. The motion reached the hands of the secondary clerk, and within minutes, a new name was announced across the room. Judge Margaret Evelyn Rhodes has been called in to review the matter. The shuffle of bodies slowed. Chairs creaked softly. I returned to my seat without speaking. Rachel leaned into her attorney and whispered something I couldn't hear. His shoulders lifted slightly. He must have believed they'd cornered me. I reached into my bag, the same leather portfolio I'd brought with me on day 1, and opened the inner pocket. The envelope inside was worn at the corners, the wax seal still intact. I carried it to the front and handed it to the clerk. This is a notarized affidavit I said signed 2 months before my father passed away. I'd like it entered into the sealed record. Judge Rhodes, seated now behind the bench, adjusted her glasses and looked down at the document. Do you understand what this means, Miss Monroe? Once I open this, it becomes part of the official record. There's no taking it back. I understand, I said. She broke the seal. Read the first few lines silently, then paused and read aloud. I, Franklin J. Monroe, being of sound mind and clear intent, do hereby declare that the initial concept, structure, and proposal for the Monroe Women's Education Fund were authored and developed entirely by my daughter Claire Monroe. I insisted her sister Rachel be presented as the face of the foundation for the purpose of preserving the family's public image. I deeply regret this decision. The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The silence was enough. A different kind of stillness, one that settles in when something irreversible is finally spoken. Judge Rhodes continued. Signed, dated, and notarized. Rachel stood suddenly. This is fake. He never would have. Sit down. Miss Monroe. The judge said, her tone calm but firm. Rachel opened her mouth again, but no sound followed. Judge Rhodes turned the final page. The motion to suspend proceedings based on conflict is denied. The affidavit is valid. Furthermore, based on its contents and the financial records entered into evidence earlier today, this court finds that Miss Rachel Monroe shall be removed from all founding and operational documentation associated with the Monroe Women's Education Fund, effective immediately. She paused, eyes lifting toward Rachel. You may have held the spotlight, Miss Monroe, but the light was never yours. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The clerk stepped forward with revised incorporation papers. My name alone sat at the top. Founder. I took them in hand, the weight of the folder balanced evenly across my palms. Behind me, the light through the tall courtroom windows had shifted. Amber rays spilled across the benches, catching the shine of polished wood and faded carpet threads. It touched Rachel's face, too, but she didn't glow in it the way she once did. She looked smaller now, not ruined, just exposed. I walked out of the room with quiet steps, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady. Outside, the sky had softened to late afternoon. The warmth had returned to the breeze, brushing against my coat sleeves as I stepped down the courthouse stairs. A few reporters stood farther down the street, but no one called out. The quiet followed me like a shadow. A welcome one. 3 days later, the press conference came. Rachel stood before a microphone flanked by 2 aides and read from a prepared statement. She was stepping back from public leadership, she said, to reflect on evolving standards and personal responsibilities. She didn't mention my name, she didn't apologize, just a list of vague phrases enough to satisfy headlines, but not memory. I turned off the television before she finished. That same evening, I walked through the front doors of the community center. It had been closed for renovations, but now the paint was dry, the furniture delivered, the final papers signed. The funds siphoned through shell companies had been returned under court order. The legal team had made sure every line was reviewed, every document corrected. Inside the walls were soft gray bare for now, but waiting for color. In the back room, a new staff member was laying out paper brushes and markers for the girls who would arrive next week. The smell of clean wood and fresh paint lingered in the corners. Langston visited once after the hearing. He didn't bring flowers, didn't bring a speech. He just stood beside me as we looked out over the common room. "Do you want me to stay?" he asked, his voice low. I thought about it for a while. Then I answered, "I think I need to see who I am without someone rescuing me, even if that someone meant well." He nodded. He didn't argue. He just placed a hand gently on my shoulder, gave it a light press, and walked out the door. Later that morning, I wandered into the art room. A handful of children had come early. One of the new volunteers had invited them to help break in the space. A girl, maybe 9 years old, sat quietly at the far end of the table, folding red paper with careful hands. When I approached, she looked up and smiled. Then, without a word, she held out what she had made, a paper crane. The folds weren't perfect. One wing tilted slightly more than the other. But it was neat, proud. I froze. Years ago, I had made one just like it. I gave it to Rachel after her first debate win. She'd crumpled it and said I was always doing strange little things no one asked for. Now, a child I had never met offered the same shape without any demand or explanation. I took it gently from her hand. It was still warm from her fingers. "Thank you," I said quietly. "I make them when I feel calm," she replied. "Maybe you needed one." I nodded. Maybe I did. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, casting a golden glow over the sidewalk. I stepped out with the paper crane still tucked gently in my hand, and for the first time in a very long while, I didn't feel like I had to explain anything to anyone. Not to Rachel, not to Langston, not to the past. Just this moment, and whatever came next. It was just past 8 when I stepped through the side door of the courthouse again. The morning was clear air, cool with a breeze that carried the scent of stone and distant magnolia. I held the paper crane gently in one hand, tucked it into the inner pocket of my coat, then made my way through security. The guard didn't ask for my name this time. Inside, the mood had shifted. Reporters were no longer crowding the entrance, no photographers, no murmuring from the press bench. Just quiet, purposeful movement, attorneys reviewing documents, clerks tapping at keyboards. I reached the gallery door just as the courtroom officer called out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Langston E. Monroe." He entered from the left side, same robe, same expression, not cold, but unreadable. Langston didn't look at me. He sat behind the bench, picked up a folder, and nodded toward the court assistant. "Let's begin," he said. Rachel was seated just 2 rows ahead. Her hands were clasped neatly in her lap, her hair pulled back tighter than before. Her lawyer, older and more cautious, now stood and requested permission to call a witness. "An expert in character assessment, Your Honor." Langston gave a small nod. "Proceed." The doors opened again, and a man in a gray blazer stepped forward. Dr. Adrian Wolfe, the clerk, announced. I recognized the name. Harvard. A reference once buried in a file I was never supposed to see. I had never met him, never spoken to him, but Rachel had pulled him into this. He took the stand, swore in, and opened his prepared notes. "I am a clinical psychiatrist with over 2 decades of institutional consulting experience," he began. "During the Harvard International Fellowship cycle, I was asked to review behavioral reports tied to a student named Claire Monroe. While I never met Miss Monroe in person, I provided a professional advisory regarding her suitability for continued academic engagement." He paused, scanning the room. "My findings suggested patterns of deflection, emotional volatility, and recurring episodes of distress likely rooted in unresolved familial trauma." Langston raised a hand. "Dr. Wolfe, were you Miss Monroe's treating physician at any time?" "No, Your Honor," he replied. "My involvement was external. Were your statements based on first-hand evaluation? They were based on submitted incident reports and departmental concerns." Langston made a brief note. "The court will consider your testimony advisory, not diagnostic." Rachel's lawyer shifted slightly, but said nothing. Langston turned to me. "Miss Monroe, would you like to respond?" I stood. My palms were dry this time. "Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to read a statement from my academic file, and I'd like it entered into the official record." He nodded. I opened the folder. The pages inside were smooth, crisp at the edges. I had reviewed them so many times over the years I didn't need to look down, but I did anyway. On March 17, 2014, I filed a formal complaint against 3 fellows in my research group. The complaint was reviewed and dismissed within 48 hours. No interviews were conducted. On May 9th, I was treated for a stress-related ulcer after 6 months of persistent obstruction of my work. I paused. Professor Laia Marks, director of the program, later sent internal memos to the grant committee. Those memos expressed concern for a pattern of targeted disruption with me as the consistent subject. The pages turned beneath my fingers. No disciplinary actions were taken against those involved. No acknowledgments were made. I was told repeatedly that I was making things harder than they had to be. I looked toward the bench. That wasn't a diagnosis. It was a warning, a way to quiet me down. Langston's face remained still. The documents I've submitted today include letters from faculty and internal evaluations. None of them list Dr. Wolfe. None support his testimony. I returned to my seat. Langston turned back to the opposing counsel. "Do you wish to continue?" Rachel's attorney looked at his notes, then shook his head. "No further questions at this time." Langston gave a nod. "Let the record reflect Miss Monroe's submission." He stood slowly, gathered his notes, and looked toward the court assistant. "Call for recess. The court will reconvene in 30 minutes to deliver findings." We stood together. Chairs scraped softly against the marble floor. Rachel didn't look at me as we exited. In the hallway, the walls felt narrower. The light overhead had cooled. I reached for the bench near the atrium window and sat down. No one said anything. Not Rachel. Not her attorney. Langston remained in chambers. I folded my hands in my lap. A memory flickered quiet and strange. Years ago, I was 8 or 9. Rachel had won a spelling bee. The whole family went out to dinner. She was given a certificate, a small trophy, a new pair of shoes she'd picked out. I had drawn her a card that morning, folded it in quarters, wrote her name in block letters, and tucked it into her backpack. She never mentioned it. Later that night, I found it in the trash under the sink, untouched. Now, years later, the feeling was the same, just sharper. But this time, I wasn't standing in the background. And what I held in my hands wasn't a drawing, it was documentation. Dates, affidavits, a full accounting of everything I had never said aloud. Langston returned to the bench at 9:34 a.m. The courtroom filled again, quiet and expectant. He tapped the gavel once. "This court finds sufficient cause to proceed with final review. However, given recent evidence, the ruling will be passed to a third-party oversight." The clerk stood. "Judge Margaret Evelyn Rhodes will resume session at 10 sharp. Langston didn't look at me. He rose, nodded once to the clerk, and exited through the side door. Rachel's attorney leaned over to her. She whispered something back. Her tone was low, steady, but the tilt of her jaw had changed. Outside the windows, the sun was beginning to rise over the tops of the buildings, casting gold across the edges of the room. The clock above the gallery door ticked forward minute by minute, and I sat there waiting. Not as a shadow, not as a guest, but as someone finally prepared to stay until the very end. The courtroom lights had shifted by the time Judge Rhodes returned. The morning sun had risen high enough to cast soft reflections across the polished floors. The clock on the far wall read 10, exactly as the clerk called the room to order. Judge Rhodes entered with a quiet authority. No robes rustling, no unnecessary words. She sat, adjusted her glasses, and nodded to the clerk beside her. "Bring forward the motion submitted by Miss Claire Monroe," she said. I rose slowly and approached the bench with the second envelope. The seal had already been broken earlier for verification. Inside was the original affidavit from my father, plus 3 attached documents: trust summaries, bank disclosures, and donor correspondence. I passed them across. The judge read through them without hurry. The room stayed silent. I looked over at Rachel, seated with her attorney hands still folded, but her posture more rigid now than before. She didn't glance at me. Her eyes stayed on the papers, as if she could will them to say something else. Judge Rhodes finished reading and set the documents down. "This affidavit," she said, tapping the top sheet, clearly states that the Monroe Women's Education Fund was conceptualized and written by Claire Monroe. The foundation's formation, public messaging, and donor alignment were constructed in Claire's name, though operated under Rachel Monroe's identity by direction of their father, Franklin J. Monroe. She paused. This deception, while informal in appearance, was supported by formal trust movement and official filings. The financial statements submitted support this. Rachel's attorney stood. "Your Honor, we request a delay to review the documentation in full before any ruling is made." "Request denied," Judge Rhodes said. "This court has been reviewing these documents since yesterday evening." Rachel leaned in and said something to her attorney too quiet to hear. The judge continued, "In light of the financial records presented and the affidavit now entered into the permanent sealed record, this court rules the following. Rachel Monroe is to be removed from all operational leadership and advisory roles associated with the Monroe Women's Education Fund effective immediately." Her gavel tapped once. I didn't move. Judge Rhodes looked back down at the affidavit. "You may have held the spotlight, Miss Monroe," she said, eyes not lifting from the page, "but the light was never yours to begin with." Rachel's expression didn't shift. Not at first. Then she reached for her pen, clicked it once, then set it aside. Her attorney remained seated, no longer writing. The clerk brought forward the amended trust documents. My name was now the only one on them. I didn't reach for them right away. I looked down at the table, then slowly opened the folder. The title page was short, clear, and stamped with the court seal. Founder Claire Elaine Monroe. The weight of it was quiet. No applause, no ceremony, just stillness. The kind that settles in when something long overdue finally arrives. The judge stood. "This hearing is now adjourned." The room stirred back to life, papers gathering, chairs sliding, doors opening. I stepped away from the table and turned toward the aisle. Rachel didn't follow. She remained seated, her shoulders straight, her chin lifted slightly like she still believed this wasn't real. I stepped into the hallway. The same marble floor, the same scuffed benches and courthouse smell, but it all felt different now, like the place had emptied of something heavy. Outside, the breeze carried the faint scent of fresh grass. Down the block, someone was pressure washing a sidewalk. That soft hum drifted toward the steps as I paused halfway down. Langston was waiting by the railing, his coat folded over one arm, no robe, no title. Just him. He didn't say anything right away. He stood with his eyes on the courthouse doors, then finally looked at me. "You did what you came to do," he said. I nodded. "Are you okay?" "I think I will be," I said. "Eventually." He didn't ask to walk me home. He didn't ask to stay. He just nodded, stepped aside to let me pass, and said, "You know where I am." I made my way down the rest of the steps alone. The sidewalk stretched wide and bright in front of me. The courthouse behind me looked smaller now. I walked without hurrying, without needing to check over my shoulder. At the corner, a familiar voice called out, "Ms. Monroe." It was Naira, the intern, who had handed me the water bottle that first day. "I heard what happened," she said. "I just wanted to say thank you for not backing down." She held out a small box. Inside were handmade buttons, each stamped with a paper crane logo, and the words, "Build quiet, build strong." I took one and pinned it gently to my lapel. As she turned to leave, she called over her shoulder, "It matters, even when it doesn't seem like it." The wind picked up again, not cold, not warm, just clean. I continued down the block, the city moving around me now, not as an obstacle, not as a stage, but just as it was. And for the first time in years, I wasn't walking to prove anything. I was simply walking home. The next morning, the courthouse was behind me, but the silence still lingered. Not an empty kind of silence, more like the space that comes after something has been released. I walked to the corner cafe near my apartment, the one with the mismatched chairs and the chipped mug I always seem to get. The woman behind the counter greeted me by name. I hadn't realized she knew it. I took my drink to the corner table by the window and pulled out a notebook I hadn't opened in years. Inside were sketches from a project I once thought I'd never finish. Educational blueprints program, outlines, notes scribbled in margins during nights I'd sat alone in my kitchen while my sister stood on stages reciting my words. This time there was no need to give them away. In the weeks that followed, I went back to work, not to the job I'd left behind, but to the mission I'd nearly let go of. The foundation needed rebuilding, not just in name, but in values. Transparency, safety, mentorship. I brought in former scholarship recipients, women who knew what it meant to be underestimated. We sat around folding tables and built something from the ground up again, but honestly, this time, Rachel didn't call. I didn't expect her to. The settlement had been signed and filed. She kept the townhouse in Charleston. I kept the foundation. We hadn't spoken since the day she left court, though word traveled through family that she'd returned to consulting work and had been speaking less at events. Our mother never reached out either, not even after the article ran. It was a quiet piece in the Sunday local Nothing Flashy, just a profile on the new direction of the Monroe Women's Education Fund. It mentioned the court hearing only once in passing, but it told the truth clearly and simply, and maybe that was enough. Langston came by one Saturday in spring just after the daffodils bloomed along the sidewalk. He wore a plain sweater and brought 2 sandwiches from a deli I'd never heard of. We ate on my stoop, watching the breeze carry petals across the curb. He didn't say much about the case, neither did I. But before he left, he looked at me and said, "What you did, it'll outlast all of us." That stuck with me. It's strange the things we carry. A paper badge that once said, "Nobody." A folder you clutch like a lifeline. A quiet promise made to yourself in a waiting room with bad coffee and fluorescent lights. But it's stranger still what we choose to let go. The need for approval, the hollow performance, the ache to be seen by people who never really looked. I still walk past the courthouse sometimes on my way to meetings. Still get that flicker in my chest when I see someone adjusting a name badge or fumbling with a folder. But now I smile because I know what it feels like to stand in that place, and I know what it means to leave it whole. If you've ever rebuilt something from ashes, something no one thought you could keep, let alone own, then maybe this story was meant for you. Thanks for sitting with me through it. If it moved you, feel free to share it with someone who might need it too. And if you're still walking through your own version of the long hallway, just know there's more than one way out. And some of us find our names on the door not by asking, but by writing them in ourselves.